This story is from Chris. The story is called I Pissed Myself, and the drug that was taken was Datura. One day, a good friend of mine named Dave told me that he had Datura and that I tripped nuts. Me, at the time, already had experience with spirit walk, snurf, or snuffadelic pills, etc. Was more than obliged to take him up on this offer. I had tripped many times and loved it. I went to his house sometime in the evening. He had ordered a large baggie of Datura leaves off the internet. I'd say around 9 p.m. or so, we ground up a good 12 grams or more into a semi-fine powder. We then got some Lipton tea bags and emptied the contents and replaced them with our Datura powder. We boiled the bags in the water until it was a dark green, like he had read on the web. We poured 1 glass apiece and chugged the gut-wrenching tea down, doing our best to ignore the horrible smell and taste. Writing about it makes me sick, it's so bad. After about 30 minutes or so, we just felt like we were really drunk, so I decided to drink another glass, but only finished half of it. Bad idea, people. Another 20 minutes flew by, and I realized that I felt like there was not the least a bit of moisture in my mouth or throat. It was very hard to swallow, and I felt like I had to urinate very badly, but as most reports conclude, only drips follow the have-to-pee sensation. We decided to go into Dave's room to listen to some good old mindless self-indulgence, which happens to be fucking awesome music to listen to while tripping or just straight stoned. He sat at his desk chair in front of his computer, and I sat at another desk chair a few feet away. As I silently enjoyed music, I began to notice a scratching sound close to my head. I turned to see Dave's zombified iguana, with blood pouring from its mouth, perched on the back of my chair. FYI, Dave's iguana died a week prior to this day. Not remembering I was tripping, I ran from his room across the hall into the bathroom, smack into the wall near the sink. I got up and looked in the mirror, and the sight of my own face made me laugh uncontrollably. I then left the bathroom and walked into the living room where Dave's sister was having a little get-together with her friends. They were unaware I was on anything until I ran up to one of her friends and fell to the floor 2 feet in front of them because my legs suddenly gave out as I was running. I got up and sat on the couch and thought I was fishing. I know this only because of the eyewitness accounts. Haha, I don't remember fishing. I then got up, not sure how much time I took to fish, but I remember making my way into his driveway to see a platoon of modern-day US soldiers scouting his yard. I brushed it off, not thinking anything odd about it. I walked to my car to find my 14-year-old brother, who wasn't even in the same city at the time, in my driver's seat. I got all pissy and demanded that he get the hell out of my car, but he just sat there staring out the window, so I told him I was gonna go tell my mom, who wasn't there either. I proceeded to the front door of Dave's house and took one last look back to see that my car door was open but no one was in it. So I got in my car and tried to start it, only to break my key off in the ignition. At that exact moment, I didn't give a shit. I got out, shut the door, and went back inside and went to the bathroom to piss. I managed to urinate successfully, yet I imagined that I unzipped and all. I pissed my pants and then just stood in front of his toilet until his older brother barged in to find me soaked in my own urine. He asked me what happened, and knowing what I did, I for some reason told him that somebody threw a beer on me. Long story short, I ended up finally falling asleep and awoke the next day at 10 a.m. when I was supposed to be at work at 9. I went to work late thinking the trip was over, only to spend my first 3 hours at work talking to coworkers that didn't work that day and customers about random problems I had going on at that time. My manager realized I was on something and sent me home. Needless to say, I should have been smart like Dave and read up on the shit before doing it. I've done it 3 or 4 more times since, only to do even crazier shit, but I've typed entirely too much as it is. So I hope what I've written thus far is educational in some twisted way. P.S. Breaking my key off in the ignition was probably the worst of this particular trip, but I've had extremely way worse events occur during the later Datura trips. Even though I've done it a total of 5 or 6 times, I refuse to ever do it again because of the things that have happened while on it. This story is from Disco. The story is called Clawed by a Giant Eagle. The drugs used, Datura and cannabis. 4 of us, me, my boyfriend Ricky, Bevan, and Jeff, were staying at a beach house in a relatively remote location on the west coast of New Zealand. We spent the entire day sleeping, chilling, running around, and carving the beautiful blue waves. So we decided what better way to end the day than with a nice sesh on the porch. So out came 2 tinnies worth of weed, the bong, and the lighters. I'd had about 4 potent hits when I felt nicely mellowed out. and decided to stop there. We'd eaten quite a bit that evening, lots of fresh fruit from a nearby orchard, and barbecued fish, so our stomachs were by no means empty. Ricky brought 8 Datura seed pods with him, each containing between 80 to 100 seeds. Since there were 4 of us, 2 people would have to babysit, while the other 2 could pop some seeds. Although I'm nearly 6 foot, being a chick, there was no way I could restrain any of the guys if the need came, so I was the one of the seed poppers. Jeff had never done Datura before, so he was a natural choice too. Besides, Ricky and Bevan were more than happy to keep their lips around the bong and laugh their asses off at us. 7 p.m. I opened 2 seed pods, one for me, one for Jeff, and we swallowed down the seeds. Prior to this experience, I'd done Datura 3 times but never had over 60-ish seeds in one sitting, so I decided I was ready to experience with a bit more and explore deeper. 8 p.m. We spent the next hour talking shit and eating marshmallows with no clear effects setting in yet, so I popped another 50 seeds. Big mistake. Apart from the effects of the weed, I felt completely normal. I could stand and walk fine and hold a slightly slurred but coherent conversation. 8:15 p.m. After another 15 minutes, I started feeling increasingly warm. Despite it being chilly night, my body was radiating a huge amount of heat. This is when the hallucination started. I felt like I was sunbathing. Though it was dark by now, I felt the sun envelope my body and drizzle it with golden rays of warmth. It felt divine. Everything was warm, loving, and inviting. Apparently by now I was down to my bra and knickers. My heart rate increased dramatically. I knew it was kicking in. 9 p.m. I was smoking a spliff, which didn't exist, and dropped it, which I read is very common in Datura use, so I crawled around looking for it, to no avail. I figured it must have somehow fallen through the floorboards of the porch. Though that was technically impossible, I stepped off the porch and lay on the grass below, gazing at the stars. I felt like me and the stars were one. We were the same. I don't know why, but I was an absolute mess, physically and emotionally. I could no longer stand properly and would sway from side to side begging it to stop. The water burned. It felt like it was sizzling as it ran down my back, but I gave into it and let it burn and melt me away. I literally felt like I was going down the drain. I thought the grains of sand being washed off my skin were pieces of me, swirling down, being carried by the burning acid water, deep down into the drain, as if they meant nothing. I vomited 4 times, with 30-second minute intervals between each. I stressfully started talking about being literally turned inside out, and again, I begged for it to stop. I let it all happen with no physical fight. It was a hugely frightening experience. I was making funny groaning noises, my skin turned white, my eyes were open, and my pupils filled my entire iris. I suddenly noticed Ricky in the shower holding me up. He looked different to how I remember. Far older and getting bigger and bigger the more I looked at him. I remember seeing my nose in the bottom corner of both eyes, which appeared to grow too. I could barely concentrate on anything, but his eyes managed to pierce right through me. Ricky dried me off and put me into bed. The entire room was spinning and turning upside down. Even though I barfed everything out, I still felt the need to vomit. I was hanging off the bed, rolling around and singing to myself. The music I heard, which was all in my head, was the most complex, incredible thing I have ever heard. I thought of it like a skyscraper, layer upon layer upon layer, jammed together to create this mind-blowing fusion of beats and notes. I can't explain how amazing it was. It was my calm in the storm. But now it was around 4 a.m. and I was over the worst. I was so exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I was incredibly restless, tossing and turning constantly. A figure appeared and I talked to it. I was actually talking to myself and speaking both parts of the conversation. I remember drifting in and out of reality. There were moments when I thought I was going mad, and other times I managed to convince myself it was just a dream. I still didn't know where I was or how I got there, but the feeling of threat was no longer present. I must have fallen asleep where I had the most amazing dream, which can't possibly be real. It was pretty X-rated, so I probably shouldn't go into any detail. I remember reading a book in my mind. I knew all the words. I then gradually woke up, but was still reading this book in my head. I had massive cuts and bruises all over my body, which were actually just minor scrapes. So yes, I was still having hallucinations. I remember everything which happened from here on out. I somehow managed to believe my mouth was on my forehead, so when I tried to drink a glass of water, it all poured down my face. I would drift in and out of reality and imagination every so often, but by now, I knew things I saw weren't real. The rest of the story is fairly boring and uneventful, but the main effects of the Datura lasted around 24 hours. I had difficulty understanding basic things, yet I could understand incredibly complex things in my head. Even now, 2 months after, I sometimes still see everything around me fade into a white light. As I said earlier, I've experimented with Datura before, but this was the first and last time I'll have 150 seeds. I'd enjoyed it in the past, but I definitely won't be doing it ever again. again. Although my account of what happened may not sound so scary to the reader, I cannot emphasize enough how truly frightening this experience was. I felt so incredibly shit throughout the experience and for a day or two after. Not only had I managed to make a total ass out of myself, I could have very easily drowned as well. In the past, I've also done LSD several times. The thing that I both love and hate about Datura is that I really can't separate reality from hallucinations. However, on acid, I knew I was seeing things that didn't exist. I'll definitely take acid again, but I'll never swallow another Datura seed in my life. This story comes from Lawrence. The story is called A Dimension I Never Want to Return To. When one of my dealers told me I had to try Datura the summer of my freshman year, I was skeptical. I was working a lifeguarding job and needed to stay sharp. I could be called into action at any moment. He assured me that it wouldn't be a problem. He was wrong. He gave me one pod and told me that half would be sufficient. Being an experienced psychonaut, I figured I would take the whole pod. It took about an hour till I felt anything. After about 90 minutes, I began to feel very dizzy and lethargic, like being too drunk. I took a fat dab to try to stabilize, but felt nothing. I just fell asleep. When I awoke, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Everything was blurry, but I was sure I was in an oven. I was really sweaty, and my elbows felt locked. I felt like I really had to relieve myself, but couldn't find the bathroom because I was blind. After about 15 minutes, my vision started to clear up and I could see. I tried to get off the couch, but I felt like I left my hands behind and my legs could barely move. With incredible effort, I rolled off the couch and began to crawl into the bathroom. I pulled myself onto the toilet and tried to defecate. I felt incredible relief until I looked into the bowl and there was nothing there. I tried again, and like I was leaking. When I looked in the toilet again, the water had turned to blood. No matter how much I wiped, the toilet paper always came up bloody. As I left the bathroom, I looked into the mirror and saw my father. I knew I shouldn't talk to him then, so I left. When I entered my living room, I could see that some friends had come over. The only problem was, they had all died. Blood was flowing out of all their orifices. It was horrifying, and I ran into my room. I tried to go online, but wouldn't turn on. Frustrated, I went to my desktop, but couldn't remember my password. I just wanted to listen to some music, but all I could do was shake my computer. I ran past the party in my living room and out the front door. I looked in the sky, and all I could see was green gas. I was sure it was making me insane, so I got into my car and just sat there for what could have been years. The next thing I remember, I was back in my house talking to my friend. She kept asking me if I was okay, but I couldn't speak. It was like no matter how loud I screamed, nothing would come out. Then my vision went blurry again, and I might have passed out. I awoke in what only could be called hell itself. It was like I had entered a dimension of pure agony. The floor covered in vomit 2 feet deep, and blood was gushing from my underwear. I waded to the bathroom to find that my dad had left me. He was yelling at a younger version of myself, telling me that I would never be as successful as my brother, who recently died of Giardia. I tried to pull down my pants to clean up the blood, but I realized I wasn't wearing anything. The only thing, I had a vagina. I am a man. I was ashamed in front of my father and began to weep until I realized I was just crying on the floor of my bathroom. I decided I need some water, so I turned on the sink, but no matter what, the water was scalding. I remember when my brother was really sick, everything, even ice water, felt burning hot to him. It was like I was inhibiting his soul and it felt good. I left the bathroom and my friends had turned into piles of rocks. I tried to piece them back together, but I couldn't hold on to anything. It felt like my hands were covered in grease. Needless to say, the rest of the night was something out of a dimension of unimaginable nightmares. Sometime around 5 a.m. I started to come down. My vision was fuzzy and I kept seeing something moving in the corner of my vision. I went to sleep for a few hours and woke up relatively okay. The road to recovery has been long, but I'm hopeful that with the continued help of antipsychotics, I will in time be able to overcome the trauma I experienced on Datura. I would not recommend Datura to even the most experienced trippers. What I saw can only be described as my own worst nightmare.